So I'm starting off with a quote from A.S. Neil. What I've got is a series of slides to do with quotations, because I want to introduce you, well, I want to show you using the words of these people, what they actually thought. Okay, so this is A.S. Neil, and my emphasis, because I have a big problem with pedagogy and the ideas of pedagogy. And my question with A.S. Neil and with others like him was, what do they start with? Yeah, and I think they start with children's rights. And in a Dominie's log, there's a lovely situation where the children have arrived late, not late, early for lunch. So the lunchtime isn't finished and they've arrived early back in the school, and it's a lovely winter's day outside, and they should be sliding on the ice slide that they've made in the main road, which Neil has had a go at during the week on the way to and from school with the kids. So he's joined with them. And he says to the children, why aren't you sliding? Why have you come back to school? You should be enjoying yourself sliding. And they said, well, the policeman has salted the slide. And he says to them, why? Why has the policeman salted the slide? And they said, well, the farmer complained, and the farmer was worried about his horse sort of slipping on the ice and injuring himself. And then Neil discusses with the children about the power or lack of power of their voice. And he goes into, he compares it that children don't have votes, and that farmers do have votes, or at least the landowning farmers have the votes, and that children are like women because they have no votes, they have no say in the laws, and therefore the law gives women half the salary. So in his discussion of in Dominie's log of the ice slide and the children playing on the ice and the fact that they come back early because there is no more ice slide, he gets a discussion about power and politics and lack of power of children. And he says to himself, few bairns should draw up a Declaration of Rights, I added. And I think that a few understood my meaning. And to me, this is one of the essences and the difference of A.S. Neil to other great educationists, is that to me, his starting point is the rights of the child. Okay, and I thought I'd just introduce you to a few characters who also thought about the rights of the child. Some of them you may know, some of them you may not know. Let me just, yeah. Okay, so this is a book on Ingersoll. And Ingersoll was a fantastic hero who fought for the rights of slaves and for human rights. And he was very influential in America, and he was a free thinker. And he talks about, if women have been slaves, what shall I say of children, of the little children in alleys and subways, the little children who turn pale when they hear their father's footsteps, the little children who run away when they only hear their names called by the lips of a mother. Little children, the children of poverty, the children of crime, the children of brutality, wherever they are, flotsam and jetsam upon the wild, mad sea of life. My heart goes out to them, one and all. I tell you, the children have the same rights that we have, and we ought to treat them as though they were human beings. They should be reared with love, with kindness, with tenderness, and not with brutality. So that's the voice of Ingersoll. And it shows you that the people who were fighting for the rights of different human groups, including slaves and women, actually saw children amongst that group that they thought we should liberate. So the arguments that, because everyone talks of children's rights as if it's very new, but I mean, this is the 1800s. Those people, including people like Mary Wollstonecraft, who fought for the rights of the child, and William Godwin, who fought for the rights of women, and William Godwin, who also fought for the rights of women, they asked themselves, can people have rights if the children don't have rights? Okay. And then Josephine Ransom. So this is going into schools, and Josephine Ransom edits and writes a book called Schools of Tomorrow, in which every chapter is a democratic school or a school based on liberating the child. And she writes it in 1919. So Summerhill is yet to be created. And she writes, it is a youth which is not afraid, which is sensible, of its inalienable spiritual right to liberty, and which walks with the dignity of comradeship in our midst, and will meet and mingle with us on no other terms. Yeah, I love the end bit. Yeah, because what are the other terms normally? The other terms are adult-defined frameworks. The other terms are measurements. The other terms are targets created by the adults. Yeah, and also the other terms are what are called responsibilities when we talk about rights. The young person must be responsible, mustn't sort of dirty the carpet or talk using inappropriate words. But she says no, they must meet with us equally, and we shouldn't demand any terms as adults. Okay, now this is Mr. J. Dover Wilson, who was HMI. He wrote an advisory booklet. It was published by HMSO, which is the government publisher. He was a senior school inspector, and he wrote a book which he dedicates to William Morris, of all people, and he dedicates it saying that William Morris is the prophet and the teachers are the ones that can give his words and philosophy to the children. This is how he ends his advisory book. On teaching humanism or humanities in the continuation school in 1921. And here he says, citizenship is not a subject any more than character or devotion or love of truth. It is a spiritual principle, an atmosphere which must pervade all our teaching and inform all our educational plans. And to him, citizenship is, as citizens, well, an example then he gives is about the humanistic class, i.e. teaching the humanities. And he says that it should be like a debating society. The problems selected for treatment must be real and not academic ones. Problems which the students hear discussed at home and in the workshop. Topics which are bandied about with heated prejudice in the daily press. He's writing in 1921. Yeah, so he's saying that there should be open debate amongst the children in a classroom, which is facilitated by the teacher, and where they're talking about any of the problems within their communities, like poverty, like the lack of health and safety in the factories, child labour, all that. Okay, this is the cake. This is the cake that I created in order to celebrate the centenary of the group of teachers that I'm talking about in a minute. It's a community of teachers that came together in East Runton, which is a very small seaside resort near Cromer in Norfolk, on the coast in Norfolk. And they came together. There were 250 teachers, and there were inspectors there as well, and educationalists and professors. There were 250 of them to begin with. A lot of them were from the Montessori Society, because the first conference was inspired by three people. Three women inspired this conference. Montessori, and it was called the Montessori Conference because her ideas of liberating the child were very, very popular in England. And then we also have Harriet Finlay Johnson, who was one of the first teachers to publish books on drama, and these are drama in her elementary school at Little Something. She ran a village school with her sister, and well, we come across her later, but anyway, so it's inspired by her, and it's also inspired by a third woman who is Lillian Deleza. And if people know about the history of nursery schools in England, Lillian Deleza is a key figure in the development and training of nursery school teachers. I think. So those three women inspire this conference, as well as Homer Lane. Homer Lane is there as a hero of this conference, and it was 100 years ago, and it was called the Montessori Conference, and there were most of the people who went, I think about 60 or 70% of the 250 were members of the Montessori Society. Yeah, there we are, me celebrating with the cake, and this is at an academic conference on the history of education, and we were sharing the cake with PhD students who were all studying some aspect of the history of education. This is at the Institute of Education, and we were celebrating. This is during the centenary year with the cake, and there are some important professors sharing the cake. Right, now the people who founded this conference, one of them was Earl Litton, and Earl Litton was president of what became, from the Montessori Conference, they changed their name democratically to New Ideals in Education Conference. So the first conference in 1914 was Montessori. In 1915 onwards, every year, it was then called the New Ideals in Education Conference. And as well as changing their title, they decided that they should have a byline, and they should have a values line. And their values line was liberating the child. And every conference which Earl Litton attended, which was virtually all of them, apart from when he wasn't in the country, he would start off by introducing the conference, telling people the history about Montessori in 1914, and then saying, we are here to look at how we can liberate the child in school. And here he says, we welcome all ideas that represent the substitution of the freedom and self-expression of the pupil. So substituting freedom and self-expression for imposed authority of the teacher. And this is the underlying principle of the conference. To get rid of the authority of the teacher and replace it with freedom and self-expression. And Earl Litton, you may not know, but he was the actual member of the House of Lords who pushed through the Education Act of 1918. Yeah, so he's not just any old Earl. He's a major figure in the history of education and the education law in this country. Okay, and then we have Bertram Hawker, who is a very quiet man. In fact, Bertram Hawker is an amazing man in terms of what he's actually done. He was involved in Save the Children as a major organizer, and he's also involved in the university, international university movement. He also helped create the nursery school movement in Australia, because I think he married in Australia. But and he says, this is he rarely speaks at the conferences, Bertram Hawker, and it's very difficult to get much information about it. But his house and his grounds were the grounds where the first conference met in 1914 at his house and his barn. And they, most people, because East London doesn't have much accommodation, I think a lot of people camped. They were either in tents or sort of sleeping in a large barn, I think, or if they knew people nearby. And he says, ladies and gentlemen, our chairman, Lord Litton, is unavoidably absent, having been detained by urgent parliamentary duties. Those of you who attended the conference at Oxford last year, which was 1918, will remember that he came straight to us from having steered the education bill through the House of Lords. Yeah. And his speech steering that education bill through the House of Lords in 1918 is actually on hand, so you can actually see what he actually said. This time it is the transport bill that delays it. This is our 6th conference, and this is the first in which he has not taken part. Yeah? So I'm trying to give you a sense of who these people are. So Bertram Hawker organised it. He set up the first Montessori school in the country, which was in his grounds. And it used children from the local village school, and there was a very good relationship between the village school and his Montessori school. And he also paid for Lillian DeLisa, who he met in Australia, to actually go to the children's house, Casa di Bambini, Montessori's Casa di Bambini in Rome, to actually learn from Montessori. So Lillian DeLisa was sponsored by him. Yeah, and he also went over there to have a look at what she was doing and was very impressed. A lot of his inspiration from him wasn't just Montessori, it was what is called the settlement movement. He was a volunteer fairly early on in his life as a young man in the settlement movement in Toynbee Hall. And if you know about the settlement movement, it's a huge worldwide movement, and it's very famous in America and in England, where you got university students and people from the middle class sort of going into and living in the poorest areas of the city and setting up a community within a community centre where they would run classes, they would have health centres, they would have, well, in Toynbee Hall, they had a children's court. For legal cases, they had a theatre. In fact, the National Youth Theatre was set up through Toynbee Hall. And he thought he was very inspired by Toynbee Hall in terms of the way the children were included within the community. Yeah. And they would have had a children's Montessori nursery within Toynbee Hall as well. Which is very, and I think we miss this out in terms of the importance of the settlement movement, not only in terms, because Toynbee Hall helped create Britain in terms of the NHS, in terms of the social, the support of social services and things. All that partly was dreamt up by people who, the Beveridge report, Beveridge, when he was young, was part of Toynbee Hall. In fact, you name anyone who was involved in the NHS setting up and things within the Labour Party, you'll find that a lot of them were influenced by such settlement movements. Okay, so he's really important. And then we have Edwin Holmes is the third man. Yeah, so we've got Edwin Holmes, we've got Bertram Hawker, and we've got Earl Litton. Now, Edwin Holmes was well, let's see what he was. This is him speaking in 1917 at Bedford College. And I went to Bedford College in 2017. They had a UN, model UN, where Tomo and Summerhill kids took part. And there were hundreds of children there. And I gave the opening speech to tell them that they were 100 years before that meeting, the UN meeting. People like Edwin Holmes and teachers throughout England, at least I think 450 of them, had gathered at Bedford College to talk about liberating the child. Ladies and gentlemen, Experiment Days is for me the fulfillment of a long cherished dream. For 5 years, I was what is called the Chief Inspector of Elementary Schools in England, in which capacity I visited every district in the country and got to know every inspector. So this is Edwin Holmes. He was Chief Inspector of Schools, of elementary schools, and these were the state schools, yeah, at the time that he was inspected. State schools were nearly all of them were elementary schools, and he was the inspector of them. And he was the one that discovered Harriet Finley Johnson, and he wrote 2 books using Harriet Finley Johnson's village school as a model of practice, which he compared to utopia. Yeah, and Harriet Finley Johnson used drama and used student participation and used student choice in order to the children to learn anything: history, geography, science, everything. And here's a lovely picture of the children of Bertram Hawker's school, in fact. They're out in the grounds. So what happened at the conference in 1914 was they got the children to demonstrate. So this is like a demonstration class. And they, in the background, you had lots of the teachers watching. And the children are basically playing with Montessori equipment and showing how it works. Yeah. Now, the quote here is from one of the other participants of that conference, called Norman McMahon, who was someone that Neil actually met and interviewed and went to see Norman McMahon's school and see him work, because Norman McMahon set up a democratic school. And he said, ladies and gentlemen, tonight I feel like a shipwrecked mariner who has reached land at last. Yeah. So this is like one of the first conferences in which loads of diversity of people, like this conference now from throughout the world, but this is mainly people from England. The first conference was English people working in England. They're coming together because they share one great passion, and that is liberating the child, freeing the child in the school, allowing the child to make their own decisions, using play, using music, using drama in order for the child to learn. And this is Norman McMahon's book, and if you notice, it's published in 1914, so it's published in the year that, so he probably was selling his book to the conference, but he was an assistant master at King Edward School, and his book is about his experiments with democracy in the classroom, not within the school in terms of the whole school, because he didn't run the school. He was an assistant teacher, a master within the school. So it's about his use of democracy within the classroom. The only point on which I stand is the view that the sole solution of the problems of education is in the free, self-governing school. And after all, the difference in the ideas of Mr. Lane, that's Homer Lane, little Commonwealth, and of Madame Montessori and of Miss Finley Johnson are infinitely less essential than their community of aim. So he recognises the differences between the three people, Lane, Montessori, and Finley Johnson. But he's saying that the underlying community aim and the aim of the community that comes to new ideals is that of free self-governing schools. Right, this is John Arrowsmith, who the New Ideals in Education. You know, this is, can I say, the reason why I'm presenting this, and I'm going to not do the whole presentation because there's quite a lot that I would love to get over, but there won't be time. But the reason why I'm doing this is because every time I go to conferences or seminars or discussions about Neil or about Homer Lane, and about even if maybe John Arrowsmith, who was a great head teacher of a elementary school in near Hebden Bridge, yeah, the people talk about charismatic people. They talk about, oh, you know, A.S. Neil only succeeded in Summerhill because he was charismatic, he was wonderful, and he created the community, and it went with him. That without Neil, the school would close. And if you read, the sadness of this is that if you read, and the same about Homer Lane. I mean, Homer Lane, even in the conferences in New Ideals in Education, every single person at the conferences said he was their hero. Yeah, the American ambassador to England introduces him at one of the conferences as his hero, because if you remember, Homer Lane was an American who came across to help run the Little Commonwealth, which was a community of adolescents that he got from the court rooms of East London, and he thought they could be transformed through democracy and running their own farm community democratically, and that they would gain, it was like therapeutic, that these adolescents would regain their humanity through living in his little commonwealth. Yeah? But even they said, oh yeah, it works, but if anyone else did it, it wouldn't work. Yeah. So, but they said, and people went there. Suffragettes went there. Yeah, Sylvia Pankhurst went there, and lots and lots of people went to see the little commonwealth, and they all came away thinking, yes, this is a wonderful place, and you couldn't even guess these people had been delinquents. But some of them then said, yeah, it's only because of his personality and charisma. And this, if you look at some of the people, the historians today, they say the same. And they say, oh, A.S. Neil had no time to network. A.S. Neil, you know, he was influential through his books and through his, he was influential through his talks. But networking, no, there was no community of people like A.S. Neil. It's like, what? Yeah, we rewrite our history, and we people like John Arrowsmith and some of the other teachers I'll mention later, they disappear. Yeah, and yet these were some of them were the most influential people in the education debate at the time they were working in 1917, 18, 19, and 20. The whole group of them in 1918 went to see the man in charge of creating the Education Act for 1918. The guy's name was H.A.L. Fisher. So the 1918 Education Act has several names. One of it is the H.A.L. Fisher Education Act 1918. And a group of about 20 of them went, mainly women, from New Ideals in Education to lobby him about the ethos of the law, of changing the law in 1918. Yeah? Okay, William Mather was a fantastic industrialist. And this is trying to show you how they engaged. That this quote comes from one of 5 papers that were read at the conference, which, if you remember, there were these sort of experimental days at the conference where teachers could share experiments they were doing. And one of them was by John Arrowsmith, who as a teacher believed you used all the senses in your learning. So in his school, every single sense, smell, sound, touch. He had a farm on his school, and his whole thing was about the children learning through using all their senses. So it's a wonderfully exciting experimental school. And he says, the scholarship and examination systems are only a species of trade rivalry brought into schools from the commercial world. The malady has so worked itself into every part of schools that children do not learn because they like learning. They cram to beat their fellows in the race for marks. Yeah. It's interesting. It's not talking about industrial. This is another thing I keep on getting really angry at, is people talk about our schools now as if they're remnants of industrialization things. They're not. They're not. They are. You look at the history of it, you'll find that they're not. Yeah, because it seems to admit that when people say, including Peter Gray, I have a big problem with his portrayal of the history. I love his evolution biology and stuff because I'm a biologist and I teach biology. I love his, explanations about the importance of play and development of play. But I sadly, I don't think he's aware of the history of education in the period of 1900 onwards, or even the 1870s onwards. Okay. Here we have, and this is another thing, is that the people who criticised the progressive education movement said, and in fact, one of the books I used to discover new ideals, because I didn't know about them when I first started working at Summerhill, is a book that totally criticises the progressive education. It's about progressive primary, the history of progressive primary schools. And the guy who writes it, the whole book, he's a traditionalist. Yeah, and yet at the same time, he has to acknowledge that our schools from 1914 onwards, and especially into war, but even after then, that our elementary schools and primary schools were defined by the progressive voice, by the people that I'm quoting from New Ideals, and by others as well. And this quote here is, I put it here because it's giving the sense of history that these people had. That they knew what they were basing their theories on. Reference may be made in particular to the valuable experiments in self-government made in schools and institutions in the United States. There were loads of experiments in schools in the United States in the early 1900s. The establishment and success of the little Commonwealth in England is sign of a growing appreciation of the importance of these experiments. So even the little Commonwealth was actually inspired by the Ford republics in America, where they were looking at children running their communities democratically. And that's major experiments in school councils within state schools in America as well, which you don't read about much. So she's talking, and then she says, nor must we forget that we owe to Russia in Tolstoy's school at Yasnaya Polyana, what was probably the first school in which self-government by the pupils was fully carried out. Isn't that exciting? Yeah. And this is Professor Millicent Mackenzie of University College Cardiff in 1915. So this is the first year. The first meeting in 1914 was before the war started. Yeah. So it was a culmination of the enthusiasm of the teachers for Montessori, for drama and education with Harriet Finley Johnson, and for people like Lillian DeLisa in nursery schools. And like an example, Shotton, is it John Shotton, in his book, actually dismisses the New Ideals as a group of friends. Yeah, group of friends. There's 250 of them in 1914. 350 of them in 1915, and 450 of them. And when you look at that, they do a list of all the delegates and where they come from and their jobs, and they come from all over the country. Most of them are women, but you get at one conference there were 7 important government inspectors of schools. 7. And another conference, H.A.L. Fisher, the guy who created the law for the 1980 Act. He actually talks to the conference at least twice. Yeah. So these are not just people who know each other. Yeah. Okay. Right. So here we have Miss Mackenzie again, and here she's saying what the laboratory is to the factory, the experimental school is to organized education. So here we have a bit of factory, industrial school. So we have organized education like a factory, and it's experimental schools, which are the labs. And this is what New Ideals in Education was about. It was about the teacher being the experimenter in the lab. And therefore, it was a time before you had education researchers. It was a time before you had the departments in universities where you have this dislocated group of people who research education. They're professors of education, but the researchers generally aren't teachers. The professors might be. In the past, in fact, the professors were very sort of liberal and very progressive, like Michael Fielding and others. And someone called Percy Nunn, who was the first director of the Institute of Education. And they were very progressive. But when we started getting this whole movement was about the teachers doing the research, the teachers doing the experiments, and the teachers then sharing it with each other. Yeah, where William Mather, that industrialist, paid for 5,000 pamphlets, and each pamphlet had John Arrowsmith's example of his work, and it had 4 other examples of. There's one example of a female teacher and using research, children doing their own researches as part of their learning. But successful experiment can only be carried on when, as in a laboratory, all necessary material and conditions can be secured, and where there is no outside influence. This is very important, because this is part of the thing they found, was that the elementary schools had the freedom, they didn't necessarily have the money, but they had the conditions. They had enthusiastic teachers and head teachers, and so a lot of the examples were in elementary schools, and with the secondary schools, they found weren't providing so many examples, and they had to discuss why. And it was basically the influence of exams, of parental pressure about what my children do after secondary school, yeah, and about other issues, and inspectors looking at inspection results within the secondary school. I might move on. This is about the relationship between democracy and schools. So this is a teacher, and her name, I can't see it because I've got this thing here, is Miss Hughes, and her title was A Wider Life for the Teacher. She's speaking at Oxford, the Oxford Conference in 1918. Every conference they had was a different city in Britain, so it moved around so that people could go, that you could get different sorts of people at each conference, and it happened every year. And during the war years, it was organised mainly by women. It was the women who organised and it was the professors or lecturers within the college who were women who helped organise the conference. The committee that ran New Ideals was the majority women, and the conference delegates were mainly women, including most of the speakers. Yeah, and also their reports were published by a women's publishing group as well. So women were major. If you think about the time of Women for the Vote and the suffragettes and suffragists, you've got to think these were women who wanted democracy. So what was their vision? What was Sylvia Pankhurst's vision of democracy in East London if it didn't include the rights and democracy for children? Yeah, the girls, how can girls grow up to be equal to boys if they're simply obedient within school, and if they have no voice even within school? How could they get a voice when they're women if they haven't had it when they were children? Yeah, and people forget this. Yeah, I went to, when they were celebrating the centenary of the women's vote, not one single workshop I went to, including teachers' workshops, had anything about what the suffragettes and suffragists thought of schools and education. And the conference I went to were about, the National Portrait Gallery had a whole thing for teachers about how do you teach citizenship and suffragettes. Yeah? It was brilliant, but it was like, well, but you're talking to children about suffragettes and you're not mentioning to those children you're talking to the image of the school as seen by Sylvia Pankhurst or Mary Wollstonecraft or anyone who was fighting for the rights of women. Yeah, which is a bit of an omission. And normally when I asked about it, which I would do for the audience, there was just a slight pause and puzzlement about why they hadn't included it. We British people love liberty for ourselves and for others. We are a law-abiding people, but we like to make our own laws and to govern ourselves. And yet an intelligent person reported to have said a short time ago, as he came out of a big London school, well, I'm glad I know something of your history and your government, for I should never have imagined these boys were being prepared to be citizens of a democratic, self-governing country. I saw nothing but an autocratic government by the teachers. Then Miss E.P. Hughes, who is simply a state school teacher, she says, I do not think we always prepare our pupils, even for today, much less for tomorrow. Isn't that interesting? That we have so many people in our conferences and on the sort of new education for the for the web and education, this new industrial revolution of knowledge, the revolution of knowledge, and we need to educate children for tomorrow. But they were talking about that in 1918. Yeah, and in fact, I think they knew more about what they were talking about then than we do now in terms of the importance of where do we stand? Where do our feet stand? Whatever method you're talking about, whether it's Frenet or Montessori or other, or Stein or whatever, or democratic or libertarian or progressive. But what do we stand on? What foundations? And I go to the progressive education conferences in Italy, and it's a marketplace. Yeah, it's a marketplace. They're all sort of they are celebrating each other, but it's like it's for parental choice. Yeah? It's like, well, what happened to the commonality that was there in the 1918, and that was there not only with private teachers, private schools, which was mainly, if it was there in private schools, it was like Summerhill. They would have children up until 18 or whatever normally. The state schools, the elementary schools, they were state schools, and they were trying to do exactly have democracy, play, choice within their schools. So what I'm arguing here is that because the title of this presentation was about Summerhill and its contribution to modern education. To me, Summerhill is the symbol. It's the candle in the darkness which represents these teachers, these voices from the past that we can reference today. And we can also reference, say, well, why does your school have a playground? Why does your school teach music? Why does your school have afternoon clubs? Why does your school have art? Yeah. Why does your school have creativity? Why does your school have anything to do with participation? If the schools do have those things, then it's because of teachers like Neil. And remember, Neil was a state school teacher for at least 8 years before he sets up Summerhill. Yeah, and people forget that they. So this is a movement mainly of state school teachers who are practicing what they're talking about, and they're sharing that practice. So Miss Hughes goes on to say, it is obvious that school government had better follow roughly the form of government outside. E.g., the people should vote by ballot, choose their governing body with the right to depose it. Derry Hannum was like that, children being part of school governing bodies, make laws and administer them, delegate powers in terms of committees or other groups, or ombudsman or whatever, like it somehow. But a grave difficulty remains. We are supposed to be preparing them for a better tomorrow. So for Miss Hughes, it's not enough to give the children the power, to give them the vote, to give them a sense of control over some of the people in the governing body, to give them the sense of creating laws and helping to administer them and delegating powers. That's not enough. We've also got to think about how we teach them so that they can not become soldiers, so they can not become a part of the brutality of future wars. This is St George's in the East. This was A.S. Neil's favourite state school. He visited it on their, he knew Alexander Bloom, who was the head teacher, and he visited it on their prize giving day. And as you see here, this is a school where there are no awards, no marks, no examinations, and no punishments. Yeah, and it's the most democratic school in the country at the time. It was set up in 1945 in bomb-destroyed East London. it was run as a democratic state school in the poverty of East London. And when the head died, the streets were full of parents and children crying as the funeral went by. And there were 3 pages in the national press about his funeral. And what the inspectors say about this school, they said, this is the school of the future. They said every school should be like this school. This is HMI report, Ofsted report on the school, said that this school should be followed and copied. Yeah? It's not, okay. No. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just quickly talk about, and because it's not just important for us adults to know about anything like this, it's important that we engage teachers and children and schools in this kind of history. So, and what I want is what John East wanted when he, as the director of the children's BBC film and series Summerhill, when he was interviewed about why did he want to do it. And at the time he was director of Children's BBC, so he ran Children's BBC. He wasn't just director of one film, he was actually running the whole unit of the Children's BBC. He said, I want to change the paradigm. I want to change the way we see school. Yeah. And I agree with him, and I think that's what we need to do. It's not just Summerhill, and his TV series and film are brilliant at changing the paradigm. And I use clips from it when I work with state school teachers and children, that they get people to think, you know, how can a school, it works, yeah? The fact that it works, democracy, children's rights, children taking, learning through making moral decisions, children making decisions about their own learning, that it all works. Okay, so this is a group. These are 2 groups of secondary school children arriving at the town hall in Tower Hamlets, East London. One school's called Langdon Park School, where Dizzy Rascal came from, and the other school is on the Isle of Dogs. It's called George Green School, and both of them have an incredible diversity. George Green School has a lot of white students, more than most white students within the borough because of the Isle of Dogs. Okay, so this is a slide that started the day. They arrive at these children I hire this bus, and we have the Student Voice, Summerhill Trust, New Ideals in Education. So, and the 1918 Act. So what the whole day is going to do is celebrate the Student Voice, Summerhill School, and what happened in 1918. So I give it a framework. It's being Human Festival at the time, and it's also local government celebration at the time, and we're celebrating 100 years of Summerhill a bit early. And then this was the leaflet, the flyer that went out to, well, one of the flyers that went out to advertise it it was advertised at all the schools, and about the fact that we're going to start the town hall at 9:30. We're going to go on to Whitechapel Art Gallery by bus at 15, and then we're going to go to Parliament Square. And in that, we're going to celebrate and examine what the modern school could be. Here's me introducing it to the children after they've arrived. And I introduced the fact that this is the picture of the bridegroom. The bride is Harriet Feeney Johnson, not Harriet, but yeah, it's Harriet Feeney Johnson. So yeah, Harriet Feeney Johnson marries, and I think when she marries, she has to give up being a teacher. But so there's a picture of Harriet Feeney Johnson with her husband, and on the other side are her children in her little something school, and they're interviewing each other. One girl is holding up some flowers, and I think another boy has a pot with a plant in it, and they're sort of interrogating, they're exploring the flowers and the plant pot, and they would go on walks, picking things up and exploring them, doing research on them, and then the children would interview each other. So the child that's done researching the flowers would then be interviewed by the other children about the flowers. They'd say to her, "Why is the flower red?" And then she'd say, "Oh, it's red to attract insects, yeah? So that they can feed on the nectar or all the pollen and things. And they'd say, well, what, when does the flower? Yeah. So it's like, we would call it hot seating now. She then went on to use drama, but she started off by using nature. Derry's put his hand up. Yes, Derry. What do I do? I don't know what to do with Derry's hand. Kata?
Oh, I've done it again.
That's it.
Is it possible to say a word, or should I wait, Michael?
Well, you say a word, go on.
Well, I was just thinking that all my work in 3 state secondary schools was grounded in everything that you're talking about. I knew it belonged to a tradition and its support. I didn't know as much as you do, but I knew a lot of it. But I had to teach it, I had to learn it for myself. There was absolutely nothing in my College of Education training as a teacher that brought any of this rich tradition into sort of my awareness of what I would try and do when I was a qualified teacher. Nothing. So where did it all get cut out? Where was the continuity broken between this wonderful stuff from the First World War period and just after, and the complete ignorance, and not just of the student teachers, but of the teachers teaching the teachers? And now we're moving into a phase where teacher education is going to be even more tightly controlled by the behaviour management merchants, and everything you've talked about is going to disappear. So what made the break, and how can we make sure that it comes back? I think the answer is, of course, to have more people like you talking about it.
I think the break was there at the very beginning, in the sense that the break between the elementary schools and the nursery schools and that of the secondary schools. And then also in terms of the history of education, when you look at the history of education, it is mainly a history of secondary school education. Yeah, so they focus on what they see. It's just childhood. It's just play and things. There was I think the historians have, in a sense of education, belittled or dismissed the history of elementary schools and just focused on secondary schools. And they were aware, New Ideals in Education were aware that they were failing with the secondary schools. And they said, we're failing with the secondary schools because of inspections of results, because of parents who want outcomes for their children once they've left the school in terms of work and in terms of exams. And that's what they needed to destroy. And the thing about our whole education debate was that the nursery schools and the elementary schools wanted to influence the practice of the secondary schools. And what we've had is the reverse. We've had the secondary schools and the national curriculums, and they thought the national curriculum as well. The national curriculum was hindering the secondary schools when there was one. But the saddest thing is we never learned from the elementary and nursery schools. We never respected them for what they did with our children. And we respected outcomes as exams, and we respected, to me, it's a reflection of the values of our universities and the sense of a degree, the sense of the lecturer, all that, and going to a lecture, receiving a lecture for an hour, and then go to another lecture, whatever. To me, that is why they didn't succeed, is that they failed to colonize sufficiently the secondary schools. Yeah, not that there weren't great secondary schools like St George's in the East, but and not that they weren't respected by the inspectors, by the government in a way. But again and again, we come to the. I think during the war, you said I think that they were very influential right up until Thatcher, nearly. I think it was Thatcher and just before Thatcher, where we started looking at exams as a way of liberating working class children in terms of, and also the grammar school system. I think the grammar school system was a huge mistake. And ironically, can I say there's a tension here, because Cyril Burt, who was the psychologist whose work justified the grammar schools in terms of his work on IQ, was actually a very active member of New Ideals in Education, and he actually spoke at it. So it's interesting, and if you read into the how we mathematize the mind of a child in terms of measurement with IQ and other things. And I think that's another thing that destroyed the New Ideals values was the IQ testing and then the psychologists coming in.
Yeah. I often think that I was very fortunate to start my work in a secondary modern school where these kids had failed the academic selection test at 11, and in a sense nobody cared what you did with them. So you could discover that the democratic approach was successful and then take it into comprehensive schools. And that's my story, really.
No, absolutely, yeah. I mean, the secondary modern schools, because that's what St George's in the East ultimately was a secondary modern, and the inspectors there were saying every school, because it was such an enthusiastic school for learning. And the bus, can I say, the 15 bus comes from one of Alexander Bloom's projects. There was a class, I can't remember the name of the class now, of children, and they were given their project, or it was suggested to them and they agreed with it, was that they could choose any site along the bus route of the 15 bus. Then they would have to write to them and phone them up and arrange to visit and research. And when they visited them and researched the place, so they could visit, the 15 bus goes past the National Gallery, it goes past Beach Street, it goes past Selfridges, it goes past, if you look at, it goes past the Tower of London. It's got fantastic, and it goes all the way through East London in terms of, and they came up with an exhibition they created of their own work, and they'd go out on their own. A teacher wouldn't be with them. They'd get a group of 3 children, they'd go off to the Tower of London, they phoned them up and said, look, we're visiting, we're doing research, we want to create that, and they created an exhibition. Yeah, of it. And I tell the children that's why they're in the 15 bus. The 15 bus in this day is representing, and can I say the 15 bus is also, it was 2 things. One, it was a project in St George's in the East, and 2, it is an image of the film, which you could call a very bad film in terms of the way it portrays the school. The film To Sir with Love is based on, with Sidney Poitier, is based on St George's in the East, and it's a film where good old Sidney Poitier turns around the children and the working class children, and it seems to be a very brutal school, and it's failing because the head is a progressive, and he's weak, and he wasn't weak, and it was one of the most successful schools in the country at the time. Yeah, the good old, I can't remember the guy who wrote it now. Oh, Braithwaite, good old E.R. Braithwaite, who wrote the book. He worked at the school. And he writes a book where he's the hero, whereas the school should have been the hero. But I used the clip of. There's a lovely clip of at the very beginning with the song where he's on the 15 bus going into East London across the bridge and things. So I played that to these students so that they are aware of the 15 bus, this wonderful film. Okay. Oh, here I'm talking about my hat. I'm wearing a hat that my grandfather gave me, and what I'm doing is modelling what Harriet children's school children were doing. The children in the room have to interview me as the hat. They ask me about the hat, where's it from, why am I wearing it, or whatever. So they ask me questions about it, and then I get the children to do the same. I got the children then to interview each other about one of their favourite object. If they were to be their favourite object. What more would it be? And they found out about each other using an exercise that Harriet Finley Johnson could have used. So if we go on, this is Kingsley Hall, part of the settlement movement. And you had Doris and Muriel Lester, and I think that's Muriel Lester, a lovely young woman there. And there you have a picture of Gandhi, who stayed there during the conference. He could have stayed in Kensington, but he decided to stay here because he wanted to show his solidarity with the working people of East London. And he stayed at Kingsley Hall. And Kingsley Hall was a settlement that created a Casa di Bambini. They created it, still there. It's still working. It's called Children's House. It was, I think H.G. Wells opened it when it was opened, and Kingsley Hall not only set up that school, it also ran a school before it built Children's House, where children could come and take part in a very sort of democratic way. And play was a major aspect of this particular settlement community, yeah, and children actually taking control of their learning. And also learning using nature. And this is the image of, in the centre is of the children at Kingsley Hall.
Michael, just quickly, I want you to carry on. Actually, I'm going to have to go, but if you don't mind, I'll give you host, and you can just carry on until you want to finish it. Are you happy to do that?
If I can, I'll finish it. Say in 10 minutes. Yeah, I'll time down. Is 10 minutes all right for everyone? Or 5 minutes? I'll do it in 5 minutes. Forget it. 5 minutes.
That's no problem. What we'll do, Michael, we'll just give you host, and you can just finish up, because I'm going to have to go. I want to grab some food, and then I need to sleep because I've got to wake up early for tomorrow.
Yeah, I'm working tomorrow.
Henry. Yeah. Henry.
Yeah.
I need 1 minute of your time at some point. When it's a good time.
Okay. Marco, that's fine. How can we do that? Can we do this? Can we ring each other separately? Sorry, Michael. I've just stopped you in your pace.
Yeah, because I want to finish quickly. And
okay, you carry on, Michael. Carry on, Michael. Marco, stay in, and we'll talk afterwards then.
Okay.
So this is the children chatting to each other about their favourite objects, interviewing each other to find out about themselves. Yeah, and then this, just to remind you of the fact that from the town hall, ultimately they're going to go to Whitechapel Art Gallery, which has a great history linked to children as artists. Right, this is just okay. So this is Goodbye, Mr. Chips. This is about the double page spread in the Daily Mail about the death of Alexander Bloom and how important it was and how democratic the school was. Okay, now then the idea of what the children were going to do is, once they met each other and things had chatted, they get into groups, and each group was given a quote from this guy, from Earl Litton, from his speeches to do with the 1918 Education Act, including the speech in which he made in the House of Lords. Yeah. Now this quote is actually, he writes later in 1921, and it's a quote from him about how he saw the school as a result of this change in the law. Yeah. So how did he see the elementary school? He sees it, and this is how he sees it, because of the law that he helped to create in 1918. He sees the elementary school as the regional museum of any given locality, so town or village. In it will be stored and classified information relating to the natural features, the animal and plant life, the public services and the buildings, and the historical records of the neighbourhood, collected by the children themselves and set forth by them, i.e. displayed by them, under the direction of their teachers. And they're displayed as maps, charts and plans, together with specimens of peculiar local interest or application that they've gathered in their rambles. So this is very much like St George's in the East, Alexander Bloom School, with the number 15 bus. Instead of walking and gathering, they use the 15 bus to create this exhibition about as a museum, as a cultural celebration of the different histories of the points along the 15 bus route. The school itself would become of greater interest to the children, their parents and the parish generally, and their children would cease to be merely passive objects of instruction. This is the kind of outlook that is manifest in most of the schemes. And when he says most of the schemes, he means those that are resulting from the 1918 Education Act. So this is a leading politician who pushed the Act of the House of Lords. And this is his vision of what kind of schools should be. State school, these aren't private schools, he's talking about, state schools. Yeah. And wouldn't it be glorious if this was what they were like today? Mm-hmm. Now, this is the children, and they've each been given, like Earl Litton, second reading in the House. So he's pushing it through. It's the second reading of the 1918 Education Act. It's on my birthday, 23rd July. Not 1918, but yeah. And so each of them were given either a long or short quote, and they have to discuss it, think of what they feel about it, compare it with their school, and then they've got to have a debate about how their school should be according to the views of Earl Litton. Yeah, and compare it. We see, therefore, says Earl Litton in this one, we see, therefore, in many of these schools, in place of the self-expression of the pupil, the assertion of the teacher. In place of freedom, restraint. So he's being highly critical of schools based on teacher authority and teacher restraint. Yeah, and he's very critical, actually, of teachers lecturing. Yeah, so if you were children in my school when I was a teacher, he would hate this, what I'm doing to you now. want you to go out there and research on things. Yeah. So the children will then have to discuss this and think about, well, what is the authority of my school? What is the sense of freedom? Yeah. Do we have much self-expression in our school? Yeah. And then this is again, okay. Now let's move on. There are loads of quotes, which here we have: teachers are using the timetable and curriculum, not so much to impart knowledge as to make citizens. Amidst the mechanical tyranny of his industrial and commercial surroundings, so it's the surroundings, not to fit the scholar for life. Yeah, so they're surrounded by mechanical tyranny, and the idea of developing the child and the character of the child is to fit them so they can survive with surrounded by this mechanical tyranny and their commercial surroundings. And to place him in vital relations, they're trying to get in the student to be important within their communities, local and imperial, so local and around the world, of which he is a member. Sadly, there was empire. This particular speaker didn't question the concept of empire or the writer. The schools are coming to aim deliberately at giving opportunity for self-development and self-expression to all types of personality, and to eschew consciously any attempts at crashing down native growths of enthusiasm and power. Yeah, just imagine if someone said that in our schools. Yeah, teachers shouldn't crush native growths of enthusiasm and power. They should let children develop self-expression. Yeah, this was the London County Council. This is published by the London County Council, and it's their review of what they're doing in London. So this is local government. Yeah, and this is the scheme of what the London government want teachers to do. Yeah. So let's talk about, A.S. Neil and Homer Lane as single pioneers whose schools were closed once they left. Yeah, that's a load of rubbish. And can I say that the UNESCO have 100 PDFs of the great educationalists of the world? If you read Neil's, if you read anyone involved with New Ideals in Education in that group, or there's a group, international group called the New Education Fellowship, which was created 100 years ago today, where not today, this year, and A.S. Neil was actually there before he went on to Germany to set up Summerhill. He was actually there as a journalist, editor of their magazine. But if you read the UNESCO's PDFs about these people, like read the Summerhill one, the guy who wrote it, as some professor in Paris, says Summerhill could not stay open without Neil. The whole thing dismisses Summerhill as the charisma of this incredible educationalist leader. Yeah? They do the same with the other people within. So even UNESCO demeans the very history of New Ideals, New Education Fellowship, by saying yes, it worked, but it was only because of the power of these individuals, and it's not appropriate to roll it out in state education or in other schools. And yet we have the London County Council in 1918. In 1920. It's supposed to 1920. They're reviewing what they've been doing since for the last 2 years in terms of as a local education authority. Yeah, and I was showing this to school kids, to London school kids, and to their teachers. Yeah, so this is Harriet Finley Johnson just showing where she started using drama, and the kids created their own costumes, they wrote their own scripts, and they did their own research in order to create their own plays about whatever they chose. Yeah, and this is them doing their gardening. And in the top right-hand picture is of this hut. And it's a hut they did a story of called Tig. And Tig is a story of a prehistoric boy who's discovered, I think, it's a wonderful story. And it's written by the guy who helped Richard Leakey become the great explorer, the great paleontologist he was. Richard Leakey, if you want to know anything about cultural consequences of new ideals and things, you've got to realize that Wilfred Owen, great poet, his therapy was based on Dr. Arthur Brock, who was a medical doctor in the army up in Scotland. And he spoke to New Ideals, totally agreeing in their values, and actually saying that the work he was doing with the bomb people with shell shock was the exact work you should do with children who are industrially shocked, who are shocked by and dehumanized by industrialization and by poverty. And his method was about, was similar to Harriet Finney Johnson and all the others. It was about learning locally, learning about culture, being creative, like Wilfred Owen edited the Hydra, which was the magazine that Arthur Brock created. And so when you read Wilfred Owen's poems, you're celebrating the literature of therapy that was based on the values of new ideals. There's me talking to the children that we've now moved into the debate. We're at the town hall, we've moved into the mayor's debating chamber, and I'm just sort of introducing them to it. Then I introduce the counsellor for children. So she's responsible, this woman here is responsible for looking after the welfare and children of Tower Hamlets, and she explains to them what she does. And then the children go on to have their debate. Here, the boy here is chairing it. I'm standing back, sort of hidden somewhere, and these children are expressing their views that they've discussed using Earl Litton's quotes. So they're talking about what education should be like, what schools should be like, according to now rather than 1918. Here they are voting, and you can see that it's the room full of a diversity of children from different ethnic groups and different cultures. And then the Council for Children handed out this human rights booklet, which is a children's rights booklet that Summerhill helped fund, by the way. A donation from the Summerhill Trust actually helped publish these booklets, which were published by the Children's Rights Alliance for England. Right, Clara Grant is a teacher from East London. She set up a, I can't remember the name, a settlement by her school. So she was head of an elementary school, and one of her things is about creativity in children. And she published a book which explains how she gets the children to make toys. Oh no, to make toys. And the book has these lovely pictures of toys. And she would actually, her method was you'd have loads. It's like the woodwork in Summerhill. You know where the materials are, you know where the tools are, you go and make whatever toy you want. If you don't quite know how to make it because you don't remember what it looks like and things, there might be examples of things that you can be inspired, that will inspire you and help you. But the idea was that toy making was totally run by the children, and they just had boxes of different materials that then they could use. So, and she went to the first 3 conferences. Clara Grant she went up to East Runton and she spoke. We actually have her words in the report. She wasn't a speaker, she was in the audience, and she criticized the Montessori method. She said, of course, you can do your Montessori method, but how much money does it cost? Yeah, because you have to buy the Montessori method. And she said, and how much space do you need? I'm in my school's in the east of London, and I don't have the space in the classroom. I don't have the money to maintain or to buy the things. And what they would do, what the English teachers would do, they make their own equipment, much to the dismay of Montessori. Yeah, and they would use her methods, and in fact she refused. She hated not hated, but she sent a message to the first conference, Montessori Conference, wishing them well and saying, yes, liberate the child, liberate the child. But later on, she would refuse to sit next to some of the people who had sort of adapted her ideas and things. Because that was the whole point of New Ideals, was the teacher owns the methods, the teacher negotiates and experiments and then shares, and then they take up what works. Yeah. And here we have the 3 very important images. One of them is Nellie Dick, which is the young woman with her husband. Nellie was a young Jewish girl in East London. She set up a modern school, which is based on Francesco Ferreira, who was an anarchist. And she set up an anarchist school in Whitechapel. And one of the activities that her anarchist school did was the children ran the school. The children could decide who they wanted to come in, and they would have very famous people who were visiting East London as guests that they could interview or chat to. But the children, when the suffragists and suffragettes were like Sylvia Pankhurst and others, were campaigning in East London, what would the children do from the Whitechapel Modern School? They would go out and they would surround the suffragette so that no one could attack them. The children would form a wall between the women and the protesters and the violent men to protect the men. Yeah. And there's the picture on the right there is Sylvia Pankhurst, who set up a Montessori nursery in the mother's arms, and I think she set up at least 2. And she was an incredible woman who not only looked at the education of the children, but also in terms of play as well. And so she didn't just fight for the rights of women; she also saw the importance of the rights of men, of children. Now, can I say that Sylvia Pankhurst, even though Millicent Garrison Fawcett is a suffragist in the statue, Sylvia Pankhurst is actually on the surrounds of this statue. So there are suffragettes around. So this statue doesn't just celebrate suffragists who were the peaceful legal ones. It also celebrates people like Sylvia Pankhurst who broke windows. Now we get onto the bus and we leave the town hall and we go first to the art gallery in Whitechapel. And each of the children split up into groups and they see one set of artists who do this. There is actually a marble caption just saying what the art is. So this caption is untitled self-portrait. So that's the art. Yeah. So they're discussing what is art, yeah, according to this. So this is one. And then another group were looking at a whole series of installations to do with, from one artist, looking at capitalism and looking at, this is an eagle looking at a nest. And another group looked at this wonderful video and installation where children, there was a famous display of sweets from all over. I think it was celebrating our joining of the European Economic Community. And they had sweets from every country in this incredible display. And then to open it, they invited children from local schools. And guess what the children did? They took apart the displays and ate them. Yeah. And but what an artist did was they took the pictures and the newspaper articles from that moment and they recreated it. So this is the children from the school from the bus watching a video of children they would know in primary schools, their local primary schools, just eating loads of sweets. So they recreated the exhibition, and then they had a security guard there who was desperately trying to pretending to stop the children from eating. And then the children are so polite. They only take one at a time and they taste them and they share them around. It's not like what was claimed in the national press that it's sort of a riotous sweet eating that happened. But it's so all these exhibitions looked at art in terms of children and sweets and rights in terms of expression and politics and looking at the portrayal of the self in terms of how different artists look at self. They also, another group, which I haven't got a picture of, looked at the video of Summerhill. There was an artist who had an installation about Summerhill at the time that this was done, and one group looked at that. Okay, and then once they looked at their art, they were inspired by the arts to do placards about themselves and about important things to them, and also about things they wanted to change. And what they did, we then got on the bus with the art, and we arrived at, this is Westminster Square, in front of the House of Commons, and they then formed a circle, as Nellie Dick's children did. And Nellie Dick was a child, in fact. She was a teenager when she set up the school, her modern school. So they acted knowingly, because we discussed it in things. They formed a circle around the suffragist Millicent Fawcett, pretending that they were protecting her, yeah, and for a photograph. And then they met the local MP, who was Jim Fitzpatrick at the time, and they did this is going back to the settlement movement of Kingsley Hall, that during just after the First World War, the settlement movement organised marches. They called them walking newspapers, where they had children and adults from East London create banner headlines that they carried, like these children are carrying placards, and they were the headlines at the time were ignoring the starvation and the poverty of Germany. the children of Germany, the victims of the First World War, the children were starving, and government policy was causing them to starve. And the settlements, the peace settlements, and no one was, so they formed a walking newspaper to tell the community. They walked all the way from East London to the House of Commons. So here we are, joining Gandhi with our own newspaper headlines to do with debt, and to do with, I think, changing school lunch times, and to do with whatever issue. It was up to them. They could do whatever issue they had. Yeah, and then we travelled home with the 15 bus. And this is the last slide of that day, which was at the town hall before they travelled. And this is to do with just linking it to do with the war and to do with health. Prevention is better than cure. We have not merely to re-educate ourselves, we have to see it to it that the coming generations do not repeat our errors. Now, this is Arthur Brock, the therapist for the person pictured here. I think that, no, in fact, that is Arthur Brock there. And he's talking as a therapist to people like Wilfred Owen and others, soldiers who were destroyed by shell shock and things. Our wish is that our children should get to understand life. That is the relationship between man and the world, human beings and the world. Very well, let them begin by getting into relationship with the immediate part of the world about them. And this they will do for themselves to a large extent, if allowed to. Yeah. So this is someone who sees the horror of war, who is responding with therapy to help to try and rehumanize the soldiers, sadly, so they could go back to war, which was rather hypocritical, but and saying that we need our children to do what Litton said, and that every school should be a cultural centre, museum for their local village and town. And that's the end of my presentation. The thing I want to see is this history, as Derry said, that this history going into places like Tower Hamlets, places like, and to do with schools, primary, and because it's primary school children and secondary school children that do this. It's not just secondary school children and things. And for us to start, even if it's slowly, getting every single school in the country to recognise that the modern school, the good modern school, is one that is child-centred, it's democratic, it's cooperative, it's about learning to develop our humanity and not simply trying to prepare us for work or university. Yeah. And the history, they're astounded by the fact, because I think these schools are far better than any of our modern schools.
Yeah, I agree.
Michael, could I just quickly say, I wish inspectors in training could listen to you, because I don't think you'd find one inspector in the English inspection system who knows anything about what you've been talking about.
Yeah.
And it makes me feel quite proud to have been one, because I do know what you've been talking about.
No, absolutely. I was really proud when he resigned. Was it in front of David Blunkett? It was one of the conferences, wasn't it? Or was it the Children's Commissioner? I remember you resigned in public as an inspector because of what was happening to Summerhill. Can I say that when we lobbied every single chief inspector of schools, I took the children down to the House of Commons and we lobbied them through when they met with the Select Committee on Education. We lobbied them because they met, I think, twice a year with the Select Committee on Education. We lobbied them for about 3 or 4 years, even after we'd won the court case, because we were lobbying them to try and get every school to be inspected like Summerhill. We had such an incredible... The court case resulted in the best inspection system ever for any school in this country, modern inspection system. And we lobbied the Select Committee saying every school should be inspected like us. We had two experts who oversaw and reviewed and advised our inspectors. Just imagine that. No, when I tell school teachers this, they can't believe it. It's like, how can your school have a voice during the inspection? No school has a voice during the inspection to criticise the inspectors. You have a voice, to tell them how you think about your school, but you can't tell them what you think about the inspection. And that's how Summerhill was inspected. So Derry's asked sort of questions about continuity and about why it was dropped. I'm still fascinated by that question about why our schools no longer reflect the values that they did in the up until the 1940s. Can I say that they affected all the education acts? I mean, the wonderful history of progressive schools, which is written by a traditionalist, and I can email you the reference. He admits that he wasn't just into war, that from 1914 onwards, that it was the progressives who input into the education legislation. They input into the reports and the government reports. They were part of the advisory bodies to government about what should schools be like. And the inspectors, as Derry says, the inspectors of from 1914, 15, 16, they went to these conferences. They took part. They spoke at these conferences, and they were people totally admired Edwin Holmes as he lost his job. If you know the history, he lost his job because he wrote something that was accidentally published by the minister for education. They weren't called the minister of education, but his boss published it by accident, and it was a letter basically criticising most inspectors throughout the country, because most inspectors throughout the country, in terms of just local inspectors, were inspecting according to results and things, and he thought they were inappropriate people to be inspectors, and they had to sack him because he was the chief inspector of elementary schools, and he was basically criticising his own workforce.
I think, Mike, the creation of the tripartite system at the end of the Second World War, because there was another wave of idealism to create a better society. Just like after the First World War, it happened again after the Second World War. But Butler, a kind of aristocrat, got to grips on the shape of the new system and created the tripartite system with grammar schools for the middle class, who could go on and compete with the private educated public school boys, and then the secondary moderns, where almost everyone else went, and it absolutely perpetuated the class system. And the technical schools that were supposed to happen didn't happen. So you got an elite joining the other elite, the grammar school boys joining the public school boys, and then everyone else sent to really rubbish secondary modern schools. So the whole wave of idealism at the end of the war was undermined by the aristocracy, in fact.
Yeah, and by the strict structuring and the selective process. No, absolutely, I agree. Cecilia, is it?
Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for this session. I think it's wonderful to put all of us in the historical context. And I think we need to do it in all our different countries as well.
Absolutely, because it was international, and Australia. I mean, because Bertram Hawker, very famous in terms of the setting up of the Association of Nursery Teachers. I think he bought their building. I think he actually funded their headquarters and their first conference. With Lillian DeLisa as one of the role models, I think.
This is what I was going to talk about. That.
Yeah. And I want to
sorry, Jerry. Sorry, can we? Jerry.
Sorry, Jerry. It's still my turn.
Sorry, Jerry.
And you commented partway through that so many women were involved. In the whole thing about suffragettes.
Yeah.
And I want to just ask your view that do you think, in response to Derry's thing about why things fell apart, is it because of this, as well as it being about the nursery schools and the younger children, it's about women as well?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the women had to fight in Australia to maintain their control of the nursery teaching and the training of nursery teachers, and they actually won. That fight, because the universities, which are male dominated at the time, they wanted to take control of the nursery training and things, and they didn't at the time, and the women maintained it. So I agree. I think the university as a preserve of male dominance at the time. Yeah, I mean, luckily we had some really good professors as well, sort of women there as well, and they helped with the new ideals. But I agree. I think there is very much a gender. Absolutely. Yeah, and they felt very, it's like childcare. Yeah, nurseries and primary schools are childcare. Yeah, and play is part of childcare. But the real education is the men's education in these fantastic grammar schools and universities. Yeah, I agree totally with that. Yes, yeah.
Do you have any idea of how many of the inspectors were women?
Good point. There are. I haven't come across any. I don't think.
I don't think there were any.
No. Beatrice Enser was the first woman inspector. Beatrice Enser was from the Theosophists later on. She became very important. She attended the New Ideals in Education conferences, and at them she had a subgroup which were Theosophists, and they met, and then she developed that group into the international New Education Fellowship, which met at Calais 100 years ago today, and that their magazine was called The New Era, and which A.S. Neil was one of the first editors with Beatrice Enser, and then she chucked him off because he was too critical of people like Montessori. Neil didn't like set pedagogies that imprisoned teachers in method. Yeah, he liked people liberating themselves from things like Montessori or from anyone's particular doctrine of how it should be done. Yeah. But so Beatrice Enser was a major part of a lot of the meetings. And then can I say that the New Ideals went from 1914 to 1937, and I think it closes down partly because of the death of one of their key organisers, and I can't remember whether it's Bertram Hawker that dies, but one of them dies, and then it stops. But the New Education Fellowship goes on and on and on every 2 years, and they had thousands of delegates from lots of countries. So and I think the New Education Fellowship was nurtured in the New Ideals in Education conferences. So, but Beatrice Enser refused to acknowledge that. There was a fight over the history because Beatrice Enser sort of claimed that her group were sort of 1940 onwards, and that it was a Theosophist group, even though it was within the New Ideals in Education. And so she claimed that she launched it all, which it's good for a woman to sell herself. Yeah.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah. Bed calls, Michael. Thank you ever so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much indeed. Shall I close down then? Yeah. Can I say that you can email me any questions and things, and I will send out a link where you can get the PowerPoint, and where there'll be a few references in terms of articles that I've written, about this history, because all this comes from articles that I've written.
So Michael, just one quick thing.
Yeah.
So we were talking a little bit about what happened, and it's interesting to talk about what Cecilia was talking about. We really do need to look internationally. In the United States, there had been something called the 8-year study. You know what that is? Right? 8-year study. Well, what they looked at progressive schools, colleges, to see what they could do with those kids because they didn't have grades. And so that 8-year study came to the conclusion that those kids did better before, during, after, in college, after college, and so on. And so at that point, which was the late 30s, they were going to change the whole system. That's when World War II came along. That may be another turning point. That's when the unions came along. What I've heard is the unions froze things in place. And that was it.
Right.
I don't know.
It's interesting that at the same time New Ideals was meeting, the unions met, and the unions were being formed in terms of teachers, and they were responding to the politics of the situation. And one of the newspapers comments, you go to see the unions if you're talking about the administration. if you're talking about wages and conditions. You go to New Ideals if you're talking about the philosophy of education. You go to New Ideals to learn about the new methods of teaching. This is a newspaper article, yeah, because they would happen at similar times, yeah. So you get the union meeting and things. So yeah, I think in England, I mean, another thing that I get is like the Times Education Supplement. Yeah, you get this wonderful newspaper that is meant for teachers, and yet, I mean, that is the least progressive newspaper I've ever. I mean, I used to buy it every week, and I've always been sickened by what I see as the values of things that are published for teachers. Yeah, and also I agree with the unions have been, I don't know. Yeah, I think they're very conservative in terms of defending the authoritarian power of the teacher. But they're coming. I mean, they made statements in England, haven't they? Where things like citizenship. I was at the Speakers Conference of Citizenship in 1990. I think 1990 was it? Anyway, it was when the Conservatives were in power, and the speaker was Bernard Rutherall, and Francis Morel was the chair, and we had Jack Straw was the secretary of shadow secretary of state for education, and who was I can't remember who was the minister for education, was conservative, and they were all together on the same platform. You know, the Conservatives, and it was the first time. It was a time where they hit each other. I mean, there was a lot of violence and conflict between Labour and Conservatives at that particular time. And we had 1,000 people in Nottingham, children and scouts and teachers, and we were talking about what citizenship is at school. Yeah, and it was an incredible event.
Baker.
Yeah, and citizenship Baker. That was the Minister for Education. It was Baker. Yeah. And the thing was that I think citizenship started to change. That citizenship, because that's all the projects I do are linked with citizenship. Or I can get primary school kids into the town hall. I can get secondary school only because of that great guy. Who is he?
Bernard Crick.
Yeah, Professor Bernard Crick. He didn't like me personally. Professor Bernard Crick. He thought that my shoes were too dirty and things. He didn't like.
He was my mate, Michael. I got on very well with him.
I know. He refused to let me. I volunteered for his committee for citizenship education group that was being set up, and he publicly, in front of an audience of about 400 people, said, "No, I'm not taking you, Michael, because you work at a private school." I
was there. I'm sorry. Yeah. I apologise for Bernard.
No, everyone apologised. Everyone came up to me afterwards and apologised for Bernard. I mean, but I met him again and again and again, and he was so fed up with me lobbying him.
But I persuaded him, Michael, that if you wanted kids to learn about democracy, they had to do it in school and not just let teachers talk about it and pass tests. He absolutely swallowed that message, and he made sure that Blunkett, the minister, swallowed it too. And we got that into the law for all 14 to 16-year-olds for 10 whole years until the Conservatives took it to bits, and we learned about British values instead. But the fact is, we got real practical democracy in the law. Unfortunately, it only happened in about 20% of schools, maybe less.
No, but at the time, it was an incredible thing. I mean, I think it was a revolutionary act. And I like Bernard Crick because, I mean, he didn't care what people thought of him. I mean, because he didn't like people when people lobbied him about children's rights. He thought children's rights was just a list. Yeah, he thought there was much more to citizenship. And I am actually a children's rights advocate, so I disagreed with him. But he was at the British Library with some Summerhill kids and a huge audience of state kids.
Yeah,
you were there in the audience, in fact, because I remember you speaking on it. And he refused to stand up in support of children's rights being in citizenship at the time. I think
he got a bee in his bonnet about it. No. One or two academics had sort of gone for him over it. You know who they were. And he became a bit sensitive. But when the minister was under attack from the right-wing press and from Woodhead, the inspector, it was Crick who got me the money to go out and show that the more democratic schools got better results, not worse results. And that absolutely silenced Woodhead, the chief inspector. And the funny thing about it was, having tried to resign from Ofsted, Blunkett then ordered Ofsted to do whatever I asked them in terms of statistical analysis. It was quite an interesting situation. But that report still gets quoted quite often as evidence, if you like, that the more participative the school is, the more successful it is in every way.
And Ofsted started inspecting. The inspectors would use us as a practice ground for new methods of inspecting. This is government inspectors, and so we were amongst the first schools to be inspected using the voice of the child. So at one point, because we had some incredible chief, there was a woman, I don't remember their names now, but there were one or two very good progressive chief inspectors at school, and one of them was a woman who'd come from East London as a director of children's services in East London, and as a teacher, and she was stunning. And I think Christine Gilbert was her name.
That's her.
And she even presented to Children's Rights Alliance. She was the only inspector who stood in front of us, and various chief inspectors had done it before, to talk about children's rights. And everything she spoke about was in the frame of children's rights. She was saying, well, if the children's right to meet, let's see how that can happen. The children's right to express their opinion. Let's see how that, it was brilliant. She was stunning. And can I just say to everyone that I will email the organisers links and things and a copy of the. This is recorded, so you'll have a copy of that. But in terms of just where you can get any information, and also there's a website that I created that has examples of what I've done in state schools over the years with New Ideals in Education, and it's just called newidealsineducational.co.uk. Yeah, and it's got, so you can download the materials I've used. You can download there's loads of articles that I've written about New Ideals, because the idea is to get it to teachers. Yeah. So the site is there for try and get people to share practice. Okay, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for it's midnight nearly. Right, good night everyone.